webinar. Thank you for joining us. And before we get started, I want to take a moment to go over just a few administrative details. As you have noticed upon joining the webinar, everyone has been placed on mute for the presentation. At the end of the presentation, there will be a Q&A session. So in your GoToMeeting control panel, you'll see a questions box. Please type your questions or comments into the field and hit enter. Please note that the recording of this webinar, along with the slide deck, will be posted to the WEDI website, and downloading instructions will be emailed to all registrants following the live webinar. Without any further ado, I'd like to go ahead and hand it over to one of our Remittance Advice and Payment Subwork Group co-chairs, Pam Grzay.
Thanks, Sam, and welcome everyone. Thanks for attending this afternoon. We wanted to take a few moments and share some information about electronic remittance advice and electronic payments. This will be a real high-level webinar, just giving some basic information about the transactions, what they look like and how providers use them, and what some of the challenges that we might encounter with them. Along with myself, we also have Susan Brousseau with Blue Cross Blue Shield of Minnesota and Pat Wietek from Cognizant, who will be speaking. So just to get started, there's our disclaimer. So we want to just start out with some basic level setting. What is a remittance advice? Remittance advice information is adjudication information from a healthcare claim received from the insurance company. And it can include payments, denials, and even patient liability information. And it can be sent to the provider on paper or in electronic form. An EFT, or electronic funds transfer, or claim payment, is a payment made for a healthcare claim. It also can be paper or electronic, and we see it in a variety of formats or methods. On paper, obviously that format is a check, but electronically we can see a payment made via the CCD Plus format, which is a NACHA format, and that's transferred via the ACH network, and that format is actually mandated by HIPAA. We also can see electronic payments made via wire and even virtual card. So what do providers do with this information? Well, obviously the payment must be deposited in the bank for the provider to have access to the funds. The remittance information must be posted back to the provider's practice management system or accounts receivable system. The information needs to be reflected on the patient's accounts and in the provider's general ledger. Having that information posted in the general ledger makes those funds available for the provider to use for things like payroll or other things that are expenses. But we also need to make sure that the patient's accounts are kept accurate for billing. We can't bill the patients for amounts that must be contractually written off. So before any statements are sent, we need to make sure that those accounts are updated accurately. Denial and write-off information is also posted to the practice management system. Audit trail information is kept for accounting and auditing. And the remittance information is used when filing secondary claims. So what happens when all of this is on paper? Well, the provider receives a paper check and a paper explanation of benefits in the mail. The paper check must be deposited at the bank, so that means someone has to make a trip to the bank to deposit the check. And the explanation of benefits must be manually keyed into the practice management system. Typically, this means that multiple copies of the EOB must be made, and EOBs are typically very large. So one FTE at the provider site takes a copy and types that payment information from the paper EOB into the practice management system. Another FTE does the same thing, but focuses on adjustment and denial information, getting that into the practice management system. And then another FTE takes the copy and starts splitting it up and making any redactions necessary to use the information with secondary claims. There's multiple FTEs that can be involved with significant time and effort involved as well. So how do electronic transactions help? Well, when you receive your payment electronically, that goes directly to your bank account and doesn't require a manual deposit. So just like many of us may have direct deposit with our paycheck, this is similar to that. The direct deposit for the healthcare claims goes directly into the bank account. Obviously, that happens much faster than waiting on a paper check to come in the mail and waiting on someone to take it to the bank. The electronic remittance advice information comes in a standard format, which is the 835, and that can then be auto-posted to the practice management system. Electronic posting products automate the function of entering the data for payments, adjustments, and denials into the practice management system. That then is much faster, it's more accurate because there's no opportunity for human error, and it frees up those FTEs that we talked about to perform other tasks like follow-up or denial management. There are some regulatory requirements around these electronic transactions. The HIPAA legislation, originally passed in 1996, required adoption of national standard electronic formats for claims and remittance advice and other transactions, and it mandated for use for electronic transactions exchanged by providers and health insurance plans. In August of 2000, HHS adopted the first set of standards for the electronic transactions, which was version 4010, and that adoption was required by October of 2003. In January of 2009, that was updated. HHS adopted updated versions of the standards to update to version 5010, and that was required by January 1st of 2012. And that's the version that we use today. Updated standards are still in development, but no date for the next adoption has been announced. The Affordable Care Act included information about the electronic payment. It included the CCD Plus Addenda, CCD Plus format for healthcare claim payments, and made those a HIPAA requirement. So if a provider requests payment via the CCD Plus format, that has to be supported. In addition, operating rules were included in the Affordable Care Act that included some additional requirements for both electronic remittance advice and electronic payment, and those are mandated as well. And adoption for those things, both the electronic payments standard and the operating rules, was mandated by January 1st, 2014. Now I'm going to pass the ball to Susan to talk about some of the high-level structure of the 835. Susan?
Thanks, Pam. As you can see, the remittance advice and payment comes at the end of the other transactions. This workflow starts at eligibility and benefits, and throughout the flow in the claim process, we get to the remittance advice and to the payment. There we go. And really, this is about the transaction flow, the electronic transaction flow between providers and payers. So again, we have providers and payers interacting all along this workflow until we get to the remittance advice and the payment. So about this 835 transaction and the business function it fulfills. The 835 transaction set contains information about the payee, the payer, the amount, and other information about the payment itself. So one thing to remember is that one 835 transaction set applies to a single payment. In other words, one 835 corresponds to one check or EFT. Now, within an 835, multiple claims can be held. Multiple transaction sets can also be included within one physical file. Healthcare providers receiving the 835 can be from large to small, can be hospitals, labs, nursing homes, doctors, dentists, and any kind of provider in the professional groups. Now, the CCD Plus transaction set contains information about the originator of the payment, in other words, the payer, the receiver, usually the provider, the bank account information for the receiver, the amount, and any other identifying information on the payment. The CCD Plus also includes an addenda record that contains information from the 835 so that you can reassociate that 835 to the payment itself. Multiple payments from the same payer can be referenced within one CCD Plus transaction. Now, the high-level transaction structure of the 835 is composed of loops. You have the header, the beginning that tells you the 835 is starting. You have the payee and the payer information. Then you start with the beginning of the claim payment batch. That includes the claim payment detail, the service line payment detail, and then you're at the end of the claim payment batch. Then you go to the provider level adjustment detail. And after that information is complete, you have the trailer, the end of the transaction set. The high-level transaction structure of the CCD Plus is also made of loops. You have the usual header, the beginning of the file. You have the company or originator information. You have the beginning of the payment batch, which includes the payment detail, the addenda record with reassociation information so you can associate that back to the 835. Then you get to the end of the payment batch and you have the ending trailer, which indicates the end of the file. The relationship of the payment to the 835, one payment, whether it's a check or EFT, is related to a single 835 transaction. The payment amount, this is important, the payment amount in the check or EFT must be the same as the payment amount in the 835. It's called the BPRO2, the total provider payment amount. Those must match. The addenda record in the EFT must contain the TRN segment, the identifier from the corresponding 835 so you can reassociate to that payment. Phase 3 core 370 EFT and ERA reassociation rules require that the 835 be delivered within 3 days before or after the effective entry date of the EFT. The rule also requires that the addenda record in the EFT contain the TRN segment of the corresponding 835. So that's a high-level description of the 835 and the CCD Plus. And now we'll turn over to Pat to give you some more information about balancing.
Hi, thank you, Susan, and good afternoon, everyone. Taking the 835 to a little bit of a deeper level, and we wanted to look at some of the major parts and what makes up the 835 and what makes it work. And of course, what comes to mind first is balancing. Getting the total payment, getting your money in the bank, absolutely number one priority. But then to process the 835, it all has to kind of flow and work together. So it has to start out by balancing. At the very lowest level, and as you can see, there are 3 levels that you need to balance, but the lowest level is your service line. Every individual service line has the total charge amount, it would have the payment, and then it would show the adjustment. And we're going to talk about adjustments in a few minutes. But those 3 pieces of information will balance your service line. And it's a simple calculation. Total charges minus any adjustments equals the payment. And now you move to the claim level, next layer up. That claim level takes all of the service line adjustments, and balances that against the claim level charge amount, which then creates the claim level paid amount. That's pretty simple also. The key there is that when you do this level of balancing, you're actually looking at all adjustments that are all the services, as well as any adjustments that may have been applied to the claim. It's typical, common, I'm not sure what the right word is there, but a lot of times patient responsibility is applied at the claim level and may not be able to be split across each line. So that might just be one example of a claim level adjustment. Once all of the claims balance, then the last piece would be the transaction, which is your total paid amount. That's taking all of the claim payments, which, as we know, have all been balanced to the service lines, and applying any provider level adjustments, and that would then equate to your paid amount. Or again, as I said, next slide, we're going to be able to talk about what these adjustments look like. One note is that the AMT segment, which is typically allowed amount, some other types of amounts, but not directly related to the claim or the service, they are not part of balancing. They're very important information, critical that a lot of the provider base get those numbers, but they are not included in the balancing. Next slide, please. So let's talk about these adjustments. They provide the information, the message, why your charges are not being paid. You send a claim or service line for $100 and you end up getting paid $50. Well, what happened to the other $50? It's critical that the provider base understands exactly why you did not get paid and for what purpose. Adjustments must be reported in the 835 for the transaction to balance, as we mentioned. Providers need this clear, specific information about the reason for the adjustment so they know what to do with it. For example, is it the patient's responsibility, based on their contract, their benefits, how much is the patient responsible for? What's the contractual obligation, which tends to be the write-off at the provider, again, tied into the contract or benefits. And then there may be some other reasons that the claim is denied. For example, maybe it was filed too late, and the payer has some very specific claim filing regulations. If you pay too late, if you submit your claim too late, you forfeit getting paid. And there's many, many other reasons that denials and adjustments can occur. But what these ultimately tell the provider is what to do with them. So the message is three parts. The first part is a group code, and that basically tells the provider who's ultimately responsible for this dollar amount that is being adjusted off. Is it the patient? Is it contractual, which means the provider is responsible for it? Is it another entity, which is kind of usually built into the reason code? There's sort of the two major levels of responsibility. The next major piece is your actual claim adjustment reason code, which are globally referred to as CARCs. We love acronyms in our industry. And this set of codes give the reason for the amount that's not being paid. I will mention that there is an entire code list. It's industry specific. There is a group that maintains the code list. It's called the Codes Committee. This code list is published 3 times a year. There are meetings that are held in correlation to those 3 times a year where submitted changes, additions, subtractions, deletions are submitted, they're adjudicated, and then the new code lists are published. If anyone ever has any issues, they need a new code, they want to change a description, the X12 website would get you to that code list, and then there's a form that you can fill out and submit for changes. And we always are encouraging changes because that code list is only as good as the people who have submitted for the message to be, sent to the provider base. So we're always looking constantly to make updates and changes and make that code list as good as possible. The third part of the message is what's called a Remittance Advice Remark Code. And there may or may not be this third level that's needed. It just depends on the CARC. Some CARCs require remark codes. Some CARCs just naturally need a remark code to give additional information. Basically, the CARC plus the RARC together is the message that the provider needs to know what to do or any action to take for that adjustment. So they further explain the reason for the reduction. Within that code list, there is a group called alerts. These codes are sort of more generic. They say you have a right to appeal, for example. Not necessarily directly related to the CARC code or the message about the adjustment, but additional information that the provider is entitled to have and that may help them with their processing of the 835. So all these codes work together to provide a complete message to the provider. And I will mention that much like the CARC code list has a committee, the Remark code list also has a committee that meets regularly to update that list and make additions, changes, deletions. So here's a couple examples. A group code CO, which is defined as a contractual obligation, can be paired with a CARC code 16, and 16 reads, the claim/service lacks information or has a submission/billing error, which is needed for adjudication. Adding on the Remark codes further defines this lack of information, as an example here is a missing emergency department record. So now the provider knows exactly what's missing. They can go back to their claim. They can gather the emergency department records. They may be able to submit them as an attachment. They may have to scan them or copy them and ship them off to the payer, whatever those business processes are. But this message will tell the provider exactly why their claim was not paid. And then here's an example of an alert Remark code that says our records indicate that you were previously informed of this rule. So basically, I'm going to slap you on the hand because we told you before that you have to have your emergency department records, and yet you did it again. Kind of a subtle message there. Another example that's a little less clear, and this is probably not, well, you can see that it's a group code in CARC 16 only, if you read it that way, which says the claim is missing information, but without the Remark code, it doesn't tell you what's missing. So all the provider can do is pick up the phone, call the payer and say, you denied my claim, you tell me I'm missing information, but you didn't tell me what it was. And then another example with an unclear message would be, again, group code contractual obligation with a CARC 96, which says it's non-covered charges, not telling you what's not covered or why. There's no additional information there. I will say that within our CARC code list, many of them will have the added information that says at least one Remark code must be provided, and that is the direction that truly a Remark code must be provided. Non-covered charges tells you nothing. CARC 16 does also have that message. You can't give a message saying you're lacking information without telling more information about it. So we have taken that CARC list and we have tried to make it as detailed and thorough as possible and actually require when that additional information is needed. Next slide, please. So now the 835s come, payment's been made, payment's in the bank based on the notcher rule or the direct deposit. 835 has been processing through. Most vendors have an application where they'll consume the 835, they'll post the payment, they'll post the adjustment. Now the provider sits down and says, well, what do I do with all this information? The adjustments basically give the guidance on what to do next. Is it posting to the accounts receivable, reduces it, allows their balance, everything to balance within their AR system. There may be some automated reconciliation outside, depending on how advanced the provider's patient management system is and vendor. These adjustments will indicate contractual write-offs. Well, usually the patient accounting system or PMS will kind of automatically do that. It will tell the provider if they need to resubmit a corrected claim. And as an example before, there was missing information, so the claim was denied. Well, by resubmitting the claim and submitting that missing information, the payer will now be able to pay that claim appropriately. Secondary insurance billing. We're all familiar, hopefully, with the concept of coordination of benefits, COB. You have patient has two insurances. We send it to the first. First payer makes their payment based on their contractual benefits, you know, and all of their rules. And now that claim has to be sent to the secondary payer so that additional payment can be made. A lot of the adjustment codes that come in both of those two claims guide the provider on what to do with the adjustment. As we mentioned, determining patient responsibility, usually one of the first steps when adjudication occurs at a payer based on, again, the benefits. It could be an appeal situation. So the claim was denied, the provider feels that it was denied incorrectly, and they have a chance to do an appeal. They would use these codes and these adjustments to be able to work that appeal. As our example was, submission of supporting documentation is critical. And then there could be other denial management processes, taking the codes and determining, sometimes there's what am I trying to say here? There's a reason that I continue to get the same denial over and over again. What's my pattern? Do I have something wrong with my system? Am I billing wrong? You know, and so denial management systems can help with some of those kinds of issues, and also just do a lot of trending. But a lot of that is all dependent upon the adjustment codes. Next slide, please. And then the last level of adjustments are what everyone loves, and they're the provider level adjustments. The segment in the 835 is called the PLB segment. These are adjustments that affect the total provider payment amount. They are not specific to a claim or service. Now, what that means is this set of adjustments cannot be included at the claim level, because if they were, it would throw the accounts receivable off. They're additional adjustments. And there's reasons for these additional adjustments, but they have to be treated at a provider level so that the provider can manage them separately. They tend to be posted to the general ledger, and again, as not posted to an individual patient claim. They can increase or decrease your total payment. And then there is always reference identifiers that help identify what the adjustment is, why they may include sort of a little bit of why is it here. So basically, there's another set of adjustment codes and then a reference identifier, which is sort of the description of what's wrong. Next slide, please. So this is the PLB segment. The two pieces are the adjustment reason code and a reference identification number. These adjustment reason codes are different than the CARCs that we just talked about. There's a different set, and by nature they have to be, because these are provider level adjustments. So some examples would be interest. The payer owes the provider interest because they have not paid the claim in a timely fashion. There could be a forward balance that's generated because an original claim had to be adjusted, and in doing the adjusted claim, the payer paid less, which means now the provider owes that payer money back. That would be set up as a forward balance. There's a lot of rules and a whole nother session we could do on how you would manage that forward balance. It depends on whether you take the money right away, whether you can, whether it has to be future, etc. Those two pieces of information provide the reason for the provider level adjustment. Typically, I believe, I would probably say typically, provider level adjustments are managed, they're some kind of a manual tracking, a spreadsheet, maybe somebody's a little more sophisticated would have a small mini database to be able to track these different adjustments. There may be some practice management systems that have the ability to auto post these dollar amounts to the accounts receivable. So in a recap, there's balancing, and within that balancing or adjustment codes, we have two major sets of adjustments. One that is at a claim service level, and then we have this other set of adjustments at their provider level. Next slide. Okay, at this point, I'm going to turn it back to Pam, and she will continue with the presentation.
Thanks, Pat. So we wanted to take a moment and just talk about the 835. Obviously, there's a lot of rules around how the 835 should look. They're all defined within the implementation guide and the operating rules. A lot of things can happen when we look at all the balancing rules, when we look at the rules around adjustments, all the things that we just talked about. Sometimes things can happen, and your 835 may or may not actually be correct. So what happens then? What do you do? Well, from a provider perspective, if you receive an 835 and you feel like it may have an issue, the very first thing to do is contact the payer that sent you the 835 to try and resolve the issue. If you don't know who to contact, there is information within the 835 itself that provides some contact information. There's a PER segment that is required that contains contact information for who at the payer to contact if there are issues. And typically there's a technical contact, and there may also be a business contact included. So obviously we want to start there. We want to try and work it out. Contact the payer. Can you resolve the issue by working directly with the payer? X12 has also provided a resource to help answer questions that people may have about the transactions. So there is a request for interpretation portal that is at x12.org, where anyone can submit a question about the implementation guides. And the purpose of this portal is to submit questions to the different X12 work groups for the different transactions and get the work group to provide an interpretation of the implementation guide based on the question that was asked. And then those responses are posted back to the portal so anyone can see them. So you have the opportunity to go in and search for keywords, and you can see questions that were previously posted and the responses to those, so you can see if other people have had the same question as you. And then that gives you the response that the X12 work group has provided, giving that interpretation of the implementation guide for that question. You can then take that information back to the payer. I mean, it may answer your question to say, well, okay, what's happening really isn't wrong, or it may support your position to go back to the payer and say, you know what, here's some more information. We need to talk about this some more. So it helps promote conversation and give just a little bit more clarity around some of the parts of the different implementation guides. Ultimately, if you cannot reach an agreement with the payer on what to do about issues you see with the file, then there is an opportunity to go to the CMS tool that's called Asset and provide some information there to get some additional guidance from CMS. So it's always been called filing a complaint, but ultimately the purpose of this process is not to be punitive or make sure that fines are imposed, but rather the purpose is to remediate issues that are there. So to act as a mediator and then work on resolving issues that have been identified. So this tool is available. It provides the opportunity to go in. You do have to register to go into the tool, but once you're there, you can provide your information anonymous, or you can request to remain anonymous back to the complainant. And it gives information to CMS to look at issues that may be occurring in the industry and, again, help resolve those. And the Asset tool also provides the opportunity to upload a file and run it through some validation and give you some feedback, whether the tool itself feels that there is an issue with the file or not. So there's some validation capability within this tool as well. So again, as Sam mentioned, I'm one of the co-chairs of the Remittance Advice and Payment sub-work group within WEDI. We do have several other co-chairs as well. And if you are interested in getting more information about these transactions, participating in conversations about the transactions, or sharing some challenges that you're experiencing and looking for some best practices to overcome those challenges, this is a great place to come. We have conference calls the first and third Monday of each month at 11 o'clock Eastern. Call-in information is available at wedi.org, so any WEDI member is welcome to call into our call. You also can register for our listserv, and we have space on iMeet that we use for communicating about work that we're doing. And you can email Sam Holby for access to that. And all of the documents that our subwork group creates are available at wedi.org for download. And we actually have a pretty large library of documents that we have created, and I'll show you those in just a moment. But it's a great place to go to get information about these transactions and different challenges that people may experience and best practices for overcoming those challenges. The work group has been working on quite a few things, actually. All of our work in progress is accessible on iMeet, and lately we've been working on a white paper looking at provider-level adjustments that Pat just finished talking about, providing some basic information about those and going through the different use cases when you might see a PLB adjustment and what some of the challenges are with that, and then best practices for overcoming that. The initial version of our paper was completed in May of 2019 and is available at wedi.org. And we're almost complete with making an update to the paper looking at overpayment recovery. That should be available soon. We did 2 presentations at the spring conference last spring in 2019, and we expect to do an additional presentation this spring coming up, spring of 2020, on overpayment recovery, looking at the information from our paper and presenting that in May. So I would certainly encourage you all to attend our conference in May and listen to our presentation. So here's some of the documents that we have available out at wedi.org, and gives you an idea of the kind of work that we do within the subwork group. As I mentioned, the PLB paper, we've looked at best practices for EFT enrollment security. We've looked at barriers to adoption for the transactions, relationship of the EFT to the 835, ongoing. You can see all of the different kinds of papers. There's a lot of information that's available at wedi.org to give you information about these transactions. So now I'd like to open it up for questions, and just a reminder, you can go to the questions panel over on the right-hand side of the GoToMeeting control panel and type your questions in there, and we'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. So I see there's one question out there asking about the PowerPoint, and it is available if you look at the handouts section of the GoToMeeting control panel. You can download the presentation now, and then as Sam mentioned, both the slide deck and the recording will be available at wedi.org shortly after the presentation is completed. So again, just a reminder to please type your questions into the question panel. Right now, I'm not seeing any questions typed in. I just want to give everyone plenty of opportunity if you do have a question. Okay, I do see a question. Let me pull that up. So this question is there anything on the 835 for virtual card payment? In the 5010 version of the 835, which is what's mandated for use today, there is no opportunity to include information about virtual card payments. That type of payment is not supported in the 835 today. In the next version of 835 that's coming up, that I mentioned earlier, that is being worked on, there is support for virtual card payments in that version of the 835. So as we move to the next version, we will be able to reflect virtual card payments in the 835, but today we cannot. So if you receive a virtual card payment today, the only option is to get a paper remittance advice for that. So again, just a reminder, if you do have questions, please type them into the question panel of the GoToMeeting control panel over on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll wait just another minute to see if any other Any other questions come in? Okay, I'm not seeing any additional questions come in. So Sam, do you want to close us out? Oh, wait, there's one additional question that came in. Well, claim group codes, are any not automatically posted to the provider system via 835? I'm having a little trouble seeing the end of that question. So it looks like the question is about claim group codes and whether those are automatically posted to the practice management system. Pat, since you spoke on that, do you want to answer that question? Pat, are you on mute?
Pam, she says her phone died.
Okay, well, I'll answer the question then. So the short answer is yes, typically practice management systems will post the group code along with the CARC, or Claim Adjustment Reason Code, so that the provider has access to the information relating to who's responsible for the adjustment amount. It's always possible that some practice management systems may not handle the group codes as well. That is strictly practice management system dependent. But typically that information is posted when the 835 is uploaded to the accounts receivable or practice management system. And then there's a different question asking about OA for other adjustments. So as Pat mentioned, there's 4 different types of claim adjustment group codes. So there are contractual obligation, CO. We saw several examples of that. There is PR, indicating patient responsibility. There is PI, which is payer initiated. And payer initiated typically means the payer's initiating this adjustment, but they don't know exactly whether it should be written off or if it's patient responsibility. So they're not assigning responsibility. And then there are OA adjustments, other adjustments. OA adjustments are used very sparingly and actually can only be used if the CARC code itself says that you can use OA with it. So there are very limited opportunities to use OA. And typically those are adjustments that might be maybe more informational. So for example, we have a CARC code that indicates COB information, that payment or adjustment information from a previous payer. And OA is used with those adjustments because those are informational adjustments that the provider doesn't want to post a second time. They've already been posted. So that would be a situation where you'd see an OA, but it's very infrequent that you should see an OA because that indicates a situation that is going to require a little bit more analysis on behalf of the provider.
Yeah, Pam, I was going to add that to you, but you said it. Typically, when we've said let's use OA, is because the provider must review that adjustment and determine what it means to them.
Great. Any other questions? Please feel free to type your question into the question box. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions being entered. Just a reminder, again, we included the information about the sub-work group meetings on the slide deck, or you can go to wedi.org to get that information. And if you do have additional questions or need information, that's a great place to go to get information. So Sam, would you like to close us out?
Thank you so much, Pam and Pat and Susan, for presenting on today's fantastic webinar. Just so the attendees know, I'll also be following up with an email that contains the PDF of the slide deck that's available on your handout in the handout section of the GoToWebinar control panel, and also the link to the recorded webinar. Thank you again. Please email me if you have any questions following this webinar, you want to get more involved with the Remittance Advice and Payment subwork group or any of our other subwork groups. Feel free to reach out. And thank you very much, and I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their week.